Thank you, Jeremy. So we have three really the best in the world faculty directors for our centers. And I will get to introduce the first one, and then they will introduce one another. And I already heard that Dan Ariely is going to give kind of a tough introduction to Deborah. So not standard introduction for Deborah. So we have, and I'll just briefly say who they are and then introduce Dan, and then we introduce each other. Dan Ariely is our faculty director for the behavioral economics. Deborah Joshua, she's our faculty director for the intergenerational lifetime change. And then we have Mark Kruder, who is the faculty director for the communication. But they will get more deep introduction, and I will just introduce Dan. So Dan Ariely is the James Duke Professor at Duke University and is a world-renowned expert in behavioral economics. Dan served as a faculty director, as I said, to the behavioral economics core with our center, but he's also the founder, director of the Center for Advanced Hindsight in Duke. The center is a lab that develop and implement behavioral intervention that help people be, listen to that, happier, wealthier, and healthier. So that's his goal. Dan is a 3-time New York Times bestseller author, and most recently is the co-creator of a field documentary, Dishonesty, The Truth About Lies. And he is also just so much fun, as you will see in a minute. So without further ado, Dan.
So thank you. So a guy comes to his mother, and he says, "Mother, after 40 years, I finally decided to get married." And the mother is so excited. She said, "I really must meet your future wife." And the guy said, "Great, how about Friday night for dinner?" The mother says, "Wonderful." He says, "You know, Mother, in the last 3 years, I dated 3 other women. Why don't I bring all 4 women to dinner, and let's see if you can guess which is the one I'm going to marry." The mother says, "That's a great idea." The guy is excited. The mother is excited. Friday night dinner. He comes to dinner with 4 women, and the mother starts talking to them. She talks to the first, the second, the third, the fourth. She goes back and forth for about an hour. At the end of the hour, she points to one of them and says, "This is the one. This is the one you're going to marry." And the guy is shocked. He says, "Mother, how well you know me? How well you understand me?" He said, "I love all of these women. I admire all of them. I'm friends with all of them. But this is indeed the one. This is the one I'm going to spend the rest of my life with." And he said, "What gave it away? What was the attribute, the skill, the quality that made it clear to you that this is the one?" So the mother looks at him and she says, "It's the only one I hate." Anyway, human nature. Interesting but predictable. So, my interest in healthcare actually came from my own experience as a burn patient. So I was burned many years ago. I was in hospital for about 3 years. I learned lots of challenging things about how we deliver health. And one of the biggest challenges I had in hospital, at least in the initial period, was the question of bandage removal. So imagine, in my case, I had about 70% of my body was burned. Imagine most of your body was burned, and somebody had to take the bandages off. And there are 2 strategies. You can either rip the bandages off very quickly, minimize the duration, but every second is going to be very painful. Or you could take the bandages off very slowly. Take a long time, but each second is not going to be as bad. Which approach would you prefer? Let's just get a vote. How many people here would prefer the quick ripping approach? How many people would prefer the slow one? Okay, this is also a test of how many of you have really not read any of my books. So most of you think that the quick ripping approach is the right approach, and that's actually what my nurses thought as well. And they would do what they thought was the right approach, and I would complain. And I said, "Let's do it less quickly, slowly, give me some time to rest." And the nurses said 2 things. The first thing they said was that they were the experts. They knew what they were doing. They were doing it all the time to lots of patients. I was just like one person. And the second thing they told me was that the word patient doesn't mean to butt in, intervene, and make suggestions. This was in Israel, in Hebrew. But actually, the word patient in every language has this passive element, right? You're just kind of being treated as a passive element, that things are being done to you. Anyway, I kept on arguing. They kept on doing what they thought was the right approach. When I left the hospital, I started studying at the university, and I learned about the experimental method. And I learned that if you have a question, you could bring it to the lab, you can try different things, and you could see what's right. And I was really interested in this question. You have a timeline, and you have a painful experience that's going to fluctuate over time. You have to do it. You have to take bandages of burn patient, but what's the right way to engineer that experience to create the least amount of pain, or if it's a good experience, the most amount of good? So initially, I didn't have much money for research. So I went to a hardware store and I bought a carpenter's vise. And I set it up in the lab and I invited people to come in and put 2 fingers in this vise. And I would crunch their fingers just a little bit for different durations and different intensities, pain that went up, pain that went down, up and down, down and up, all kinds of versions of pain. And after each of those, I would ask people, how painful was this? And how painful was that? And if you had to choose one of the last 2 to repeat, which one would you pick to repeat again? People gave me answers, and I kind of tried to figure out how do we integrate pain over time to create an overall representation. By the way, I published my first paper on this. Good news, I got some grant money, so I moved to better equipment. Annoying sound, electrical shocks. I even made a pain suit. This was a suit with 300 feet of hoses stitched through it, and I had a huge container of hot water and a huge container of cold water, and I could get people to be really cold or really hot and alleviate their pain a little bit. I also did some experiments on winning and losing money in the stock market. The last few days is not my experiment, but you know. And across all of those experiments, I learned some lessons. I learned that, first of all, if you take a bad experience and you make it twice as long, you don't make it twice as painful. You make it slightly worse, but not much worse. But if you take an experience and you change the amplitude, the intensity, now you really make things worse. Now, the nurses were focusing on the duration, when in fact they should have focused on the intensity. The second thing I learned, that pain that starts at a low level and at a high level is perceived as much worse than pain that starts high and goes down over time. And mostly for reason of convenience, the nurses chose to start at my feet and end up at my head, giving me the wrong progression of pain over time. And finally, I learned that for really long periods of pain, it's really good to give people a break, kind of brace themselves and prepare for the next period of pain. And again, this was something that the nurses did not do. When I finished the first set of experiments, I went back to the burn department I was at originally, and I gave a talk to a lecture to the nurses and doctors. And after that, my favorite nurse came to talk to me, and she said, you know what? You forgot to take my pain, her pain, into account. She said, here was this wonderful nurse, she was taking bandages off me. This was no picnic for her either. And she said, maybe she was just trying to get out of there as quickly as possible. But, you know, I said, is this really what you did? Like you traded off my pain versus yours? She said, no. And we also agreed that the goal of medical treatment is not to minimize the nurse's pain. And then I said, you know, why don't you just try it a different way? You know, I begged you almost every day to try it in a different way. Why don't you just try it from time to time to do it differently? You didn't have to commit for always. Why not just try it out? And the way she expressed it, I think, is really very general. She said every day she had a choice. She could do what she thought was the right approach, what her gut intuition told her to do, what everybody else was doing, what she has been doing for a long time, which is the quick ripping approach, or she could try something different, something that her gut intuition told her was not the right approach, that nobody else was doing, and she didn't think was good for me or for her. But because of that, because every day she was trying to do what's good, but following her gut intuition, she was making the wrong decision every day. And for me, this is kind of the big lesson. You know, we stand in these intersections really very often when we have 2 options. Sometimes we don't even see the 2 options, but we have this option that we say, this is what our gut intuition tells us is the right thing to do. This is what everybody has been doing. This is what they tell us is the right thing to do. But is it really right? Maybe we should have at least look a little bit in the other path. And if we look a little bit at the other path, maybe we'll discover from time to time that there are better ways to do things. And I think this is really the goal of our center. We do lots of things in medicine that are based on intuition. Right? We haven't tested a lot. Lots of things we didn't have a chance to test. Some things seem morally reprehensible to test. But as a result of that, we know very little. And this is what we want to do. We want to figure out what are the paths that we're not taking and what are the paths that you should be exploring. And maybe find out from time to time that gut intuition was right all along, but from time to time we'll probably find out that the way we've been doing things is not right and we should try a different approach. I want to tell you about a couple of experiments that we have done kind of to give you one intuition in this direction. So one day there was a guy sitting in my class, somebody who was visiting. He came to me at the end of the class, introduced himself. His name was Tom, still is Tom, and he was the CEO at the time of a company called Panda Express. Anybody here knows Panda Express? Have you eaten Panda Express? What do they sell? Yeah, well, it looks like Chinese food, but what they really sell is something called orange chicken. And the problem with orange chicken is that it's fried twice, it has a lot of salt, and it has a lot of sugar. It's probably the worst thing you could eat, right, or one of them. But nevertheless, it's a huge draw for Panda Express. So Tom said, what can I do with orange chicken? He said, people just love this stuff, and I would much prefer if they eat something healthier. So he gave us a restaurant to play with. And the first thing we did was to put calorie labeling on all the items in the menu. And what do you think happened? Absolutely nothing. New York City then decided to replicate our experiment. They said, let's put food calories on every fast food place in New York. And they also found that basically nothing happened. Tiny changes in a few extreme cases. Actually, in some bad neighborhoods, people started eating worse. Why? Because they saw this label that showed you how much calorie per dollar you were getting, and they said, oh, I can get more calories per dollar. It seemed like a better value. Let's get the one that has more. By the way, this idea that information matters, that the reason people don't make the right decision is all because they don't have the right information, is so tempting to believe in. Why don't people eat well? They just don't know. Just tell people. If you just tell people, everything will be different, right? As if the day after the calorie labeling was posted in McDonald's, people walked in and said, "My goodness, I had no idea. You know, up to today, I was sure this was health food. Why didn't anybody tell me? You know, this is completely shocking new information." No, the fact is we kind of know what's right and what's wrong. We kind of know what's healthy and not healthy, with a few exceptions. The biggest exception, by the way, is the muffin, right? They used to tell us muffin is breakfast food. No, it's cake. It's just dressed in a little cuter arrangement, but it's cake. By the way, the emphasis on information is so strong that the federal government now is regulating every restaurant that has more than 20 branches to post calorie labeling. And this, you might say, oh, it doesn't really cost much, but you know what? It does. Because if you're a regional restaurant and you want to be responsive to what the farmers around you are growing, that's actually a big barrier to change the menu every time. So here's something else we tried. We worked with a health insurance company in South Africa. This was a health insurance company that as people checked out of the supermarket, they were getting all the data of what these people were eating. And they gave people 25% discount on all the healthy items they were getting. 25%, great, yeah? You go to the supermarket, you buy whatever you buy, at the end of the month you get a reimbursement, 25% back on all the healthy food you're getting. This was the standard approach that they were working. We came to a very large group of people. We said, hey, we would like to offer you a new deal. You can either keep the 25% discount, or you could move to deal number 2. And the way that deal number 2 works is that if you increase your healthy food consumption by 5%, you get to keep your discount. And if you don't increase your healthy food consumption by 5%, you lose your discount. Now, is that a good deal? Not financially, because you could just get a discount. Why would you put your discount on the line? But you know what? 1/3 of the people put their discount on the line, and those third ate better, more healthy for the next 6 months. And when we stopped the program and we measured what they were doing for the next 6 months, they kept on eating better for the next 6 months. Now think about this. What this intervention really is about kind of putting a little whip on people. It's saying it's not about an information. We all need a little help. And a little bit of financial loss is a really good help. Now, in some sense, it's a little bit offensive. Right? It's a little bit offensive because it belittles people's ability to make good decisions. But the fact is that if you look around, it's very hard to think that people are making good decisions, including us. So we have lots of ideas for interventions. And the question is, how do we take different tools and promote, make healthier behavior, seem more likely, feel easier? How do we force people to do it? How we get people to pre-commit to it? But I want to leave you with one kind of big moral dilemma. And the big moral dilemma is paternalism. You know, at the end of the day, if you gave me full control over your life, I could control your bank account, your refrigerator, where you eat, you will be healthier in a year, right? There's no question about that. But the question is, how do we at the same time, what do we think about human dignity and our ability to make decisions and our ability from time to time to make mistakes, and what kind of mechanisms are we willing to implement? The reason that the mechanism in South Africa was not as offensive because people chose to go into it voluntarily. Right? It's a really interesting idea that sometimes people would choose to go into a mechanism that will eliminate choices from them in the future. And by the way, we do this all the time. Right? How many of you have ever made an appointment with a trainer in the gym, and if you could cancel it 3 hours in advance, you would have? But because you wouldn't get your money back, you go ahead and you go anyway. So we do these things all the time, and the question is, what are the range of those interventions that we could try and implement? What would be willing to accept? What would people willing to accept? So there's some, I think, also deep philosophical and political questions that we're going to face. That's basically what I want to say.